The porch light next door always turned on at 11:17 p.m. Not around then. Not close to it. Exactly. I noticed because the first time I glanced at my phone by accident, annoyed that the sudden glow had pulled my attention from the dark. The second time, I checked on purpose. By the third, I was already waiting. He stepped out slowly, like time wasn't chasing him the way it chased the rest of us. No phone in his hand, no cigarette, no restless shifting of weight. He just stood there, centered on the narrow slab of concrete, facing the tree line that marked the edge of the neighborhood. Beyond it was nothing but blackness and the suggestion of a road no one used anymore. He didn't look afraid. That was what unsettled me most. I watched from my bedroom window with the lights off, the glass cool against my knuckles. I told myself it was coincidence that I was awake, that everyone looks out their window sometimes, that noticing a pattern doesn't mean you're responsible for it. He stayed there for several minutes, sometimes 5, sometimes 10, never longer, never shorter. When he finally stepped back inside, the porch light clicked off immediately, like the moment had been sealed shut behind him. I didn't sleep much after that. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that feels intentional, curated, lawns trimmed to compliance, houses close enough to observe, far enough to avoid obligation. People waved here, smiled, asked nothing. It was the kind of place where sound traveled too clearly, where any deviation felt louder than it should. The next night, I told myself I wouldn't look. At 11:16, my body leaned forward anyway. The light came on. He appeared. Same posture, same stillness. If I hadn't seen him move before, I might have thought he'd always been there, waiting for the world to catch up. I tried to tell myself he was just enjoying the night air, that routines didn't have to mean anything, that my recent breakup had rewired my attention toward anything that felt predictable, anything that didn't leave. But predictability has a way of becoming personal when it repeats itself without explanation. On the fourth night, I stepped closer to the window. On the fifth, I cracked it open, letting the cool air settle against my skin. I half expected him to look up, to acknowledge me, to break whatever unspoken rule had formed between us. He didn't. His face stayed angled toward the trees, jaw set, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. There was weight in the way he stood, like the air itself pressed harder around him. Not menace, not threat, something heavier, something patient. It occurred to me then that he might know he was being watched. The thought sent a flush of heat through my chest. I waited for embarrassment, for the instinct to retreat. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, breath shallow, heart loud in my ears. That was the moment the balance shifted. I wasn't just noticing anymore. I was participating. The night after that, I heard the porch door open and found myself already standing, already close to the glass. I wondered, not for the first time, what I would do if he turned his head, if our eyes met, if this quiet thing between us suddenly required language. He stood there, as always, still, focused, alone. When he finally stepped back inside, something inside me tightened, like I'd missed an opportunity I couldn't name. I stayed by the window long after the light went out, staring at the empty space where he'd been, trying to convince myself I hadn't been waiting for him. I didn't know why he did it. I didn't know what he was looking for. I only knew that once I noticed the pattern, it wrapped itself around my nights, and I couldn't stop. By the end of the week, my evenings had reorganized themselves around a time that wasn't mine. I stopped starting movies after 10:30. Phone calls felt intrusive. Even the hum of the refrigerator irritated me, like it might distract me from something I wasn't supposed to miss. At 11:17, my body reacted before my thoughts did. A subtle tightening in my chest, a pull toward the window that felt less like curiosity and more like obligation. I told myself it was harmless. Everyone pays attention to patterns. It's how we stay safe, how we make sense of unfamiliar places. And after the breakup, safety had become my quiet obsession. Calder's routine was clean, contained. It didn't demand anything from me. It just existed. Still, there was an intimacy to it I couldn't explain. He never changed clothes, never brought anything outside with him. The porch light cast the same pale arc every night, carving his silhouette out of the dark. If he heard anything, a passing car, a dog barking blocks away, he gave no sign. His focus never wavered. It was as if the rest of the neighborhood dissolved once he stepped outside, leaving only him and whatever waited beyond the trees. I started noticing details I hadn't before. The way his shoulders lifted slightly when he inhaled, then settled, controlled. The way his hands stayed loose at his sides, fingers never clenching. There was discipline there, not the rigid kind, the exhausted kind, like someone who'd learned the cost of losing control and refused to pay it again. One night, without planning to, I stepped onto my own back porch. The boards creaked under my weight, loud in the quiet. I froze, pulse jumping, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. If he turned now, if he saw me standing there in borrowed stillness, I wouldn't have an excuse ready. He didn't turn. The air between our houses felt charged anyway, stretched thin by proximity and silence. I leaned against the railing, wrapping my arms around myself, pretending I'd come out for the cold. From this angle, I could see the line of his jaw more clearly, the faint shadow under his eyes. Whatever he carried didn't sleep when he did. Minutes passed, my breathing synced to his without permission. When he finally shifted, my heart stuttered. He turned, not toward me, but toward his door, and for a second I thought that was it. Another night concluded without acknowledgement. Then he paused. "You should get some sleep," he said. His voice was calm, low, not unkind, not warm either. It landed between us like a fact, not a suggestion. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure I could. He didn't wait for a response. He stepped inside. The light clicked off, and the porch was empty again. But the space he'd occupied felt fuller than before, like something had been left behind. I stood there long after, replaying the tone of his voice, the certainty of it. He hadn't sounded annoyed. He hadn't sounded curious. He'd sounded aware. That was when it hit me that this wasn't one-sided, that noticing him hadn't gone unnoticed. The realization should have embarrassed me, should have snapped whatever fragile ritual I'd built. Instead, it deepened it, because now I wasn't just watching a man stand in the dark. I was wondering why he'd noticed me back, and what kind of pain runs on a schedule precise enough to be shared without words. After that night, the neighborhood felt different, like a stage set I'd been studying from the audience only to realize the lights had shifted, and I was visible too. I learned his name the way people learn things they're not trying to, through a parcel left on the wrong porch, a signature scribbled in black ink, a name that lingered longer than it should have. Calder Wynne. It fit him in a way that felt unfair, solid and contained, like it belonged to someone who knew where he stood in the world. He moved through the days quietly, leaving early, returning before dusk, never lingering long enough to invite conversation. No music, no laughter, no signs of another life spilling out around him. The neighborhood noticed, of course. They always do. Quiet gets cataloged faster than noise. People like to say they mind their business, but what they mean is they prefer distance without ignorance. Calder gave them that. He waved when waved at, nodded when cornered. He never offered more than necessary, and somehow that made him stand out. I started paying attention during the day too, not just at night. The way he checked the street before backing out of his driveway, The way he held doors for strangers without making eye contact. He wasn't avoiding people so much as refusing performance. No small talk, no rehearsed friendliness, just presence, measured and deliberate. It made me think of how much energy it takes to be perceived correctly and how few people ever are. I wondered if anyone else noticed what I did, if anyone else felt that pull at 11:17, that subtle sense that something important was happening just out of reach, but no one mentioned it. No whispered jokes at block gatherings, no raised eyebrows. If Calder existed as a question, he was one people preferred not to ask. There were moments I thought about knocking on his door, imagining myself holding some flimsy excuse, misdelivered mail, a broken fence board, anything normal. But every version of that scene ended the same way. Me asking the wrong thing, or worse, the right one. So I didn't. Instead, I stayed in my lane, watched, noticed, learned the shape of his absence when he wasn't home, the way the street felt flatter without him anchoring one side of it. I told myself my interest was respectful, distant. That admiration didn't have to mean intrusion. Still, there was a strange comfort in knowing he noticed details too. That when he told me to sleep, it wasn't dismissal. It was recognition, an acknowledgement that we were both awake for reasons that didn't fit neatly into conversation. One night, as I stood by the window waiting for the porch light to come on, it occurred to me that maybe I wasn't invisible to him at all. The thought unsettled me more than the silence ever had, because if he saw me, really saw me, then this wasn't just observation anymore, it was awareness. And awareness has a way of asking for more. There was a particular restraint to him that didn't read as shyness or secrecy. It felt practiced, like something learned the hard way. He moved through the neighborhood as if every gesture had been weighed and trimmed down to what was necessary. No wasted motion, no excess emotion. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask permission and doesn't apologize for taking up space. I noticed how he never stayed outside longer than needed during the day. Trash out, trash in. Mail collected within minutes of delivery. When neighbors tried to pull him into conversation, he listened fully, nodded once or twice, and exited without friction. No awkwardness, no offense taken, just a clean end. It was oddly respectful, like he understood the value of other people's time even while guarding his own. At night, though, that discipline softened, not into warmth, into stillness. When he stood on the porch at 11:17, there was nothing guarded about him. His shoulders dropped. His hands rested at his sides, empty. Whatever he carried during the day, he set it down out there, facing the trees, letting the dark hold it for a while. It wasn't performative. If anything, it felt private in a way that made my noticing feel dangerous. I started to realize he was observant in ways that had nothing to do with watching people. He noticed shifts in weather before forecasts caught up, fixed a loose fence panel on the shared property line without mentioning it, returned a package that wasn't his with a note so brief it felt intentional, thought, "This was yours." It was signed, but the handwriting was careful, almost restrained, like even the letters were trying not to say too much. What drew me in wasn't mystery, it was dignity. There's a difference between someone who hides and someone who refuses spectacle. He didn't shrink. He didn't posture. He simply existed without explanation. And that felt rare in a place where everyone seemed to be auditioning for harmlessness. I told myself my interest was admiration, that I was responding to calm after months of emotional noise, after a breakup that had left me doubting my own perceptions. His steadiness felt grounding, like proof that not everyone needed to narrate themselves to be real, but admiration has a way of drifting if you're not careful. There were moments, small, fleeting, when I felt something pass between us without words. A glance held a second too long, the porch light switching on a fraction earlier than usual, like he knew I'd be waiting. Once, I caught him looking toward my window before turning back to the trees. Not startled, not curious, just aware. It unsettled me more than if he'd ignored me completely, because awareness implies choice, and choice implies judgment. I began replaying my own behavior in my head, the timing, the consistency, the way I'd positioned myself in the dark, thinking it made me invisible, wondering if my silence read as politeness or something else entirely, wondering if he'd already decided what kind of person I was. The truth crept in slowly, the way uncomfortable truths do. He wasn't unaware of me. He never had been. He'd clocked me the same way I'd clocked him. Not obsessively, not intrusively, but accurately. I wasn't watching a man who didn't notice. I was sharing a quiet with someone who had noticed first. And whatever this was, this unspoken alignment, it meant the margin for pretending was closing fast. I had thought I was invisible to him. I wasn't. I told myself it was normal to notice patterns when your life goes quiet, that after a breakup, the brain looks for structure the way a bruised body looks for heat. Schedules feel safe. Repetition feels like order. And 1117 had become the one reliable thing I could count on. At first, I didn't rearrange anything for it. I just happened to be awake, just happened to glance out. But slowly, without announcing itself, my evenings bent around that moment. I stopped starting anything new after 11. Let dishes sit. Let messages wait. I learned exactly how long it took for the porch light to flick on after the minute changed, how the glow caught on the edge of the railing, how his shadow stretched and then settled like it had found its place. I hated how aware I was becoming of myself in the process, the way I adjusted where I stood so I wouldn't be obvious, the way I killed lights and told myself it was about ambiance, not concealment, the way my body leaned toward the window before my mind admitted why. Watching him wasn't thrilling, it was grounding. Or that's what I said when the word watching started to feel heavier. Everyone watches their neighbors a little, I told myself. It's part of living close, shared fences, overlapping lives. But this wasn't casual anymore. This was anticipation. This was me feeling a small, private disappointment on the nights he lingered inside an extra minute, like he'd broken a promise he'd never made. He never looked back. Not fully, but he knew. I felt it one night, when I stepped outside without planning to. The air was cooler than I expected, sharp enough to wake me up. I stayed on my side of the yard, barefoot on concrete, pretending I'd come out for no reason at all. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me, but his posture shifted, subtle, unmistakable, like someone adjusting after realizing they weren't alone. We stood there like that for a long time, two silhouettes pretending the other didn't exist. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't carry accusation or invitation. It was level, almost gentle. You should get some sleep. Not a question, not a command, an observation. Then he went inside. I stayed frozen, the words landing heavier than they should have. He hadn't asked why I was out there, hadn't told me to stop, hadn't named what we were both doing. He just acknowledged the cost, as if he understood something about this ritual that I didn't yet have language for. After that, the noticing changed. It sharpened. I started catching details I hadn't meant to collect. The way his shoulders tensed before the light went on. The nights his hands clenched like he was bracing for impact. The rare evenings he cut the ritual short and disappeared back inside as if something had reached him from the dark. I wasn't just seeing him anymore. I was tracking him. And with that came a quiet, creeping guilt. Because empathy can slide into intrusion if you let it. Because caring doesn't automatically grant access. Because somewhere along the line, My concern had stopped being passive. I told myself it didn't change how I felt about him, but I stopped looking away. There was nothing remarkable about him in the way people usually mean it. No dramatic gestures, no visible unraveling. If you passed him on the sidewalk in daylight, you'd miss him entirely. That was part of the contradiction. Someone capable of disappearing so completely should not have carried that much gravity. He worked odd hours. I could tell by the way his car was sometimes gone before sunrise, sometimes still warm when dusk settled. He wore the same neutral colors, kept his yard immaculate without making it decorative, like order mattered, but attention didn't. He never joined the neighborhood barbecues, never lingered in conversation long enough for jokes to form. People described him as polite, distant, forgettable. They were wrong about the last part. What struck me was how observant he was without seeming curious. He noticed things without claiming them. When packages went missing on the street, they reappeared on porches by morning. When a fence panel came loose in a storm, it was secured before the homeowner woke up. No notes, no acknowledgement, just quiet corrections to the world around him. It made my earlier watching feel smaller somehow, like I'd been staring at the surface of a lake while he was studying the current beneath it. I caught him once, really caught him, watching me. Not at night, in the middle of the afternoon. I was struggling with a stuck window, muttering under my breath, convinced I was alone. I looked up, and there he was on his porch, hands resting on the railing, gaze steady, but not invasive. He didn't flinch when I noticed, didn't look away, just nodded, as if to say, I see the problem. Then he disappeared inside and came back with a tool I didn't own. He fixed the window without a word, didn't wait for thanks, didn't introduce himself, just handed the tool back like returning something borrowed. That was when I understood the difference between being watched and being noticed. He wasn't studying me the way I studied him. He wasn't collecting moments. He was responding to them. There was dignity in that restraint, in the way he never took more than the situation required. It made my attention feel loud by comparison, crowded with interpretation and speculation, and still I was drawn to him, not in a way that asked for closeness, but in a way that wanted understanding. I admired his quiet boundaries, the discipline it must take to feel deeply and show so little. I told myself that was all it was, respect, recognition, but there was a thread running between us now, thin and unspoken, mutual awareness, a shared knowledge that we occupied each other's peripheral vision. I thought I was invisible to him because he never invited conversation, never crossed the space between our yards. I mistook his restraint for disinterest. I wasn't invisible, I just wasn't entitled. The neighborhood trained people to disappear politely, lawns trimmed to regulation height, curtains drawn just enough to signal occupancy, not interest. Everyone waved. No one lingered. We lived close enough to hear each other's garage doors, far enough apart to pretend we didn't. Power here wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in glances held a second too long, in the way certain complaints were taken seriously and others vanished into paperwork. There were rules posted on laminated signs, and then there were the real ones, unwritten, enforced by reputation and quiet agreement. You could fail at your job and recover. You could lose a marriage and still be invited to block parties, but attract the wrong kind of attention. That stayed. People feared being noticed more than being wrong. The HOA emails came often, dressed up as friendliness, reminders about trash bins, about lighting, about unusual activity. The language was always neutral, but the message underneath was sharp. We see you. Cameras were justified as safety, patrols as precaution. Everything was about protection, which somehow always meant surveillance. There was one man who never attended meetings and yet never seemed subject to their rules. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. When issues arose near his property, they resolved themselves before escalation. People spoke about him carefully, as if tone alone could summon consequences. Influence without spectacle, authority without title. Watching all of this shifted something in me. I'd come from a life where conflict was explosive and obvious, where power announced itself through volume. Here, it moved quietly, and that made it harder to name, harder to resist. You could comply without ever being asked. I realized how easy it would be to become complicit, to notice something off and decide it wasn't my place, to let pattern turn into permission. I'd already done it, in small ways, looking instead of asking, assuming instead of engaging. The system rewarded that kind of distance. Silence was efficient, curiosity, dangerous. At night, when the streetlights hummed and windows glowed blue with television light, the neighborhood felt like a grid of observation points. Everyone behind glass, everyone visible, everyone pretending they weren't watching. That was when it occurred to me that the routine I'd been fixated on wasn't the strangest thing happening on our block. It was just the most honest. One man standing in the open, unshielded, marking time instead of hiding from it. That's when I realized the neighborhood didn't just track compliance or property values, it tracked people.